in the Russia probe. Now, despite the usual pre-election secrecy, this is all because of Donald Trump's own staff bringing up Russian election meddling in new talks with the Russians, plus new heat on Trump confidant Roger Stone. The news tonight, the Trump administration sending National Security Advisor John Bolton to Moscow. And then he used his appearance today to bring back up 2016 election meddling, claiming that it, quote, had hardly any effect. That assertion is making waves in Washington tonight because, well, it undercuts Donald Trump by admitting a fact that Trump has often denied. The Russians did, in fact, interfere. It also goes way beyond Bolton's purview to get into how much impact it had on the vote. In other words, what does he know? The assertion is a long ways as well from Bolton's own criticism of interference before he took this job. Consider that after that controversial Putin-Trump summit in Helsinki last summer, Bolton wrote that Putin lied to Trump. He also referred to the interference as a true act of war. Bolton's new statement also out of step with the Justice Department, which just issued these new indictments for a Russian meddling in the current midterms. That includes also public attacks on the quote-unquote scandals of Bob Mueller and his Russia probe. So as Russian interference continues in U.S. elections and casts this shadow over U.S. foreign policy, Bob Mueller, meanwhile, is continuing to gather evidence on whether one of Trump's longest-serving advisors did team up with any foreign actors in 2016. Mueller zeroing in on a name we've heard before. The question is whether Roger Stone and or other Trump associates were discussing things with Wikileaks that could amount to a crime. This is from a new Washington Post report, and it includes the details that Mueller's prosecutors have presented over a dozen hours of testimony on Roger Stone to the grand jury, that his tech investigators are reviewing gigabytes of Stone-related material. A single gigabyte can comprise over 600,000 pages of text. Now, today, Stone said he never received anything from Wikileaks or the Russians. That is a denial he, of course, has made before. Let's get started with Maya Wiley, a former counsel.
No advanced knowledge of the source, content, or the exact disclosure timing of the WikiLeaks disclosures regarding the DNC. I do not regard Mr. Assange or WikiLeaks as Russian assets. I think Assange is a journalist.
Before we get to Maya Wiley, a little bit of sound from Roger Stone. That was a past denial. Maya Wiley, of course, former counsel to the mayor of New York City and MSNBC analyst. Shelby Holliday, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering Roger Stone. And in a moment, I should mention, we're going to be joined by a former chief of staff to Bob Mueller to dig further in. But first, on this news, Maya, what does it mean when you hear that this information is being presented to the grand jury?
Well, what it means is they think they have evidence that merits the grand jury actually assessing it to determine whether or not there would be some indictable offenses. So it's pretty significant if they're taking it that route. I think it also matters a lot because, you know, fundamentally, if there was a conspiracy to defraud the United States, right, which is essentially the legal claim that the Mueller team is investigating regarding the Trump campaign and the Russian government, it's kind of critical to understand whether or not Roger Stone was having communications with either Guccifer 2.0 about those emails. Remember that he did not come forward with all of the truthful information to the committee about his contact with the Russian who was offering $2 million for dirt on Clinton. All these things suggest that they're trying to piece together the extent to which they can demonstrate not just that he may have not been truthful, which is perjury, but also whether or not he's part of a conspiracy to defraud the United States.
This comes at a time that there are lawyers in and out of the Trump orbit. Ty Cobb was part of the cooperative group that ultimately ended their tenure for what has looked like a way more acerbic and aggressive confrontational approach from Giuliani and co. Here's Ty Cobb speaking out today and rebutting one of the talking points that obviously the president uses, calling this a witch hunt.
It's important to me not to have criticism wildly thrown back and forth and turn it into a Ken Starr-like process. I think was largely successful on the front end. It's deteriorated some on the back end.
But he calls it a witch hunt. Do you think it's a witch hunt?
I don't think it's a witch hunt.
Most of America actually doesn't think it's a witch hunt. And when you look at polls, most are pretty confident in Robert Mueller's work so far. I do think one interesting thing is we reported on Friday that the special counsel is continuing to look at Roger Stone and his associates. Jerry Corsi is one of them. This is happening at a time where the special counsel is shedding staff and signaling that some key witnesses are ready to be sentenced. Mike Flynn, for example, coming up in December. Yet he still really is aggressively pursuing this line of questioning with Roger Stone. What he knew, who he knew it from, and what did he do with the information that he had, if he did in fact have knowledge of WikiLeaks releases. Now, Roger Stone sometimes says, I predicted the release of Clinton Foundation emails, and so therefore I didn't know they had Podesta's emails, and he uses it as a bit of a defense. But keep in mind, the Guccifer 2.0 persona released emails related to the Clinton Foundation, and so there's question of WikiLeaks, but you can't ignore the Guccifer 2.0 persona either, which was a conduit to WikiLeaks at the end of the day.
I'll tell you one question I get sometimes when you host a television show is, why do you interview this or that person? Right? It's kind of like if you throw a big enough party, some of your friends say, does this person need to be there or not? And reasonable people can disagree about that. Randy Credico is one of those people that is asked about. But our reporting and our discussions with him, and I know you've intersected with him as a reporter on the story as well, have given insights into where they were going in the Mueller investigation. Here was Credico under my questioning about whether they were interested in Stone when he was a witness. Take a look. Were there any questions about Julian Assange?
Peripherally, that was not, listen, most of it was about Roger Stone.
Do you think they are zeroing in on Roger Stone as a potential criminal target or not?
Well, they talked about Roger Stone most of the time. I mean, what do you think?
What do you think, Maya? Most of it, the key phrase there, most of it was about Roger Stone. So he goes in and spends hours with these talented lawyers who work for Mueller, and they spend most of their time quizzing him about Stone.
Well, look, Robert Mueller's team is a very smart team. Randy Credico is the person that Roger Stone says connected him as a back channel to Julian Assange, which means whether or not Randy Credico says, yes, I was, no, I wasn't, rather than say Guccifer 2.0, right, to Shelby's point, it matters. They're going to want to really probe Credico on what his connection was, what he did in relationship to what Roger Stone says happened. A big part of what prosecutors do is try to assess who's being truthful, not just whether or not something happened, but whether they can believe someone when they say that something happened.
Right,
Stone made very clear and has not been so forthcoming all the time.
Right, and with rare exceptions, people who lie a lot to prosecutors have reason to lie, so that itself can become a lead. I want you both to stay with me, but bring in a very special guest to the beat, first-time guest, former federal prosecutor John Carlin. He was nominated by President Obama as the DOJ's highest-ranking national security prosecutor. He also worked as Bob Mueller's right-hand man, his chief of staff back when he was FBI director, and he is the author of a new book, Dawn of the Code War, an inside look at how the DOJ and the FBI, including under Mueller, address cyber threats around the world. First of all, thanks for coming on the beat.
Thank you, Ari.
John, you've been in the field. My first question to you is, what does it mean when we see the National Security Advisor of the United States give this assurance to Russia about their impact? And how does the DOJ, in your experience, stay laser focused on preventing and dealing with these kind of crimes when there is so much other noise, foreign policy or political, around these kind of investigations?
Look, I'll say, as a general rule, the career prosecutors and agents are going to be doggedly following the facts and ignoring the noise around them in Washington. And there is no one who is better at ignoring the noise and focusing on the job at hand than Bob Mueller. That's been true throughout his career, from the Marine he was when he was saving lives overseas, to the career federal prosecutor he was, to the man I knew as director of the FBI. And there's an important story to be followed here. We don't need to speculate. What we know now from the case that came out on Friday is that the reason why it's so important that we find out exactly what happened in 2016 to our election is because Russia is at it again. They're determined to attack not just our elections that are coming up here in 2018, but our democracy.
Well, you mentioned that it was so significant legally and politically in the electoral sense of Americans finding out this time beforehand, whether it is a tiny thing or a growing thing or a we can't determine how large thing, the fact that Americans are being put on notice before these midterms strikes me as a very deliberate choice by the Justice Department. Of course, it was not under the Russia probe, the special counsel probe, that we got that particular indictment Friday. Do you think that's sunk in on people, how important that is? Because there's been so much else going on since Friday.
You know, I do worry about that this won't work. This policy of the Department of Justice, the agents, the investigators, figuring out exactly how the Russians are conducting a multi-million-dollar cross-border campaign to undermine our election. They're doing a fantastic job of laying out the facts, but then ultimately it's up to the American people to demand reaction to those facts that includes raising the cost from Russia. And you're seeing a very a concentrated strategic plan. Starting on September 25th, the Justice Department said, hey, it's our new policy. We never had this written in our books when I was a prosecutor, that we are going to make public election interference when we found it. That now we know that on September 28th, there was a complaint that was returned under seal that showed exactly that there was a woman who was working for the Russians, spending millions of dollars trying to undermine, by attacking almost everyone in our system, and just trying generally to undermine confidence. Then you had Friday. It wasn't just that the Justice Department released these facts that showed what she was doing and made it public. You also had the Director of National Intelligence and the rest of the community warning the American people and those that are entrusted with protecting our elections that the Russians are going to attack. So that's quite a lot of information that was put out for us.
Well, you have the prosecutor's knack for a lot of detail in a concise space, which it's fascinating but also disturbing, some of what you lay out. Because you worked so closely with Bob Mueller, I want to get your view and get your reaction here to the way Roger Stone has responded to these public reports. Our reporting suggests, as we've shown, that he is at least of interest, appears to be at least a subject of the investigation, and people have testified to that effect. Roger has not said that he's been called in to give his own testimony, but here are his attacks on your old boss, Bob Mueller. Take a look.
Out of control special counsel Robert Mueller is now poking through every aspect of my personal, social, family, business, and political life, grilling my longtime associates in an attempt to fabricate some offense in order to destroy me personally and financially. I'm ready to fight. I will never roll on our president.
John, prosecutors are not perfect by virtue of having the job. We cover all kinds of investigations. What is your view of Mr. Stone's allegation, a serious one really, of potential misconduct, that this is an effort to personally destroy him rather than gather facts?
There's no one more by the book than Bob Mueller. And the fact that there's any public conversation about Roger Stone's role at all, I'm sure has nothing to do with Mueller or his team, who are famous for not leaking. It's a boat that never leaks a drop. I'm sure to the frustration of many of the reporters that work with you. What they are going to do, though, is follow up on things like, as they've already revealed in a criminal complaint, they know a Russian intelligence operative fed information that Russian intelligence operatives stole from the Clinton campaign and others to Wikileaks, and they know that Wikileaks then released that information in order to harm the campaign. They know that at the time that occurred, there was a multi-million-dollar campaign to undermine our elections, and they know that that was directed by military and intelligence operatives in Russia. So of course they're going to follow up to see who might have been in contact with those Russian military and intelligence operatives.
Absolutely. I think what's so important about this is remember that Roger Stone had a meeting with someone who offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, who's Russian, for $2 million. And apparently the problem was the price. So this isn't setting up a situation.
Price, not the treason,
not
you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all of the breadcrumbs that Robert Mueller is following are actually on the ground, and you can see them and you can follow them. So to suggest what Roger Stone is really doing is what he's always done. He's being a public bully to sort of suggest that for his own political ends, the political ends of his allies and Donald Trump, he's trying to distract. But all of the facts make clear, including his own refusal to be honest with the committee in Congress, in the House, about the fact that he had the meeting in the first place, tells us all we really need to know about Roger Stone.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.